Hi, Ixchel. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in our translator interview series. Let's please start with you telling us about yourself. How did you come to translation? What attracted you in this field? How long have you been in this field? And so on.
Okay. I'm originally from Mexico, and I love to read. So when it was time for me to go into university, I decided I wanted to study literature and languages. It was easy for me to learn English, so I decided to study English literature. And from there, there were 3 different specializations for my career, and you could choose between didactics, translation, and critical theory. So I chose translation because I thought that it was a good way to bring closer all that literature that it's not known in Mexico because it's not available in the language, even though we have a lot of literature that is translated from the US and the UK and other English-speaking countries. But I knew there was a lot that it wasn't readily available for the public. So I really liked reading, so my main focus is literary translation. After finishing my BA, I started my MA in translation here at Toronto, Glendon College. And I've been pretty much translating since I was midway my BA, translating short stories, trying to translate poetry, and then translating several other kind of texts in order to earn money and gain a living.
So you already mentioned that your main specialization is literary translation. So is there anything else you enjoy most outside of literary translation?
I think any kind of text that is about culture and kind of talks about a city or maybe a community, anything that kind of gives you details to know more about how other people live and work and study and do life the way that I don't do it, so that way I get to learn about how they do life.
What do you like most in the translation process?
I think kind of learning more about other people, because translation is, for me, it's mainly research. So when you have a text and you might know some things, but there are other components that you are not familiar with, so it kind of forces you to do the research. So for me, I love doing that research because then you end up knowing things that in any other way you wouldn't really learn about if you didn't do the research.
So since you're involved in literary translation, I assume there are lots of situations when you may be stuck with a certain passage in translation. How do you deal when you come across challenges? Like you mentioned, research is probably one of the ways. Any other tips?
Research helps, and something about literary translation is that it's not only about the content, but it's also about the form. So I think form is sometimes what becomes more of a challenge in literary translation, especially poetry. I think it's important to know that the poetry form of one language doesn't have to necessarily translate into the other language, because that other language has its own natural forms and natural ways to say things. So like whenever I'm stuck on something, I have to think about how this target language will say it in a way that I can create that same effect that's on the source text, and also keeping content, but also shaping form so it resembles the source text. I was going to say something.
Can you say that you can project this strategy to other fields of translation, to other specializations, like not only literary?
Yeah, of course. We do a lot of legal translation, and legal language and legal documents also have different forms in different languages. So of course, I know that something that in English says something, and even though there's a way I could translate that in Spanish, I know that it won't sound it won't sound natural and it won't sound the way someone writing it in Spanish will say it. So I know I need to adapt the form in order to make it sound more natural to the to Spanish, to the target language.
What, in your opinion, is the most important skill a modern translator should have?
Especially nowadays, I think someone that is tech savvy needs to, a translator that is tech savvy has more opportunities, because then they can easily access, websites that help with research, websites that help with finding jobs, and a lot of the clients that approach you want someone that they don't have to babysit and they don't have to teach how to do things little by little, because they should know how to use Word, use track changes, use all those tools that are basic for translation and for research, and to kind of help you with the translation process. Someone tech savvy, someone that knows how to do the research, that from one word can make connections. So that way, from that word, if you don't know what it is, you can make the connections to broaden your research and really get at what the source text is telling you, so you can make sure that when you translate into the target text, you get all that information for the reader.
How do you keep up to date about new topics, tools?
Well, the associations, ATA, with the ATA newsletter, so whatever, ATA is always up to date. So I see I read what they have. Also, there's a lot of literary translation reviews and like magazines. So that way I also know what is the kind of literature that is translated nowadays and what are the kind of authors that get more read. So a lot of reading, a lot of for example, reading fiction, so you know how the language is evolving, because fiction is where authors kind of create and experiment more with the language. So reading fiction both in my source language and in my target language helped me know more about the language and know how it's being used by the people that read it every day.
How about sharpening your skills, like your translation skills? I know you're a very active translator, but I assume still even active translators need some maybe workshops or practical seminars.
Yeah, workshops are not easy, but helpful. Workshops are helpful, seminars and like practice mainly. I think practice is the main thing. And also being in touch with other translators, because then you get to exchange ideas and that helps you sharpen your tools, your skills, because you can see how other people are doing it and you can see how you can either adopt something or adapt it to meet what you do and how you do things.
How do you usually correspond or communicate with other translators?
Well, being like with associations, that helps. I have the privilege that I am friends with people from my master's degree, and we're all translators, and we all have like different things that we specialize, that we do, so that way I learn from their fields that I'm not familiar with, and I can see how first just interest and great to know how other people do things, but then also how it can help me in my practice.
Great. So now you know that the translation industry is developing, and now there are more other activities, or they call them translation-related activities that are out there. So what else are you engaged in beside the translation process?
Well, I think there's a lot of authors festivals, and a lot of these authors festivals have like they have their translation components, and they also have editing components. So like publishing, how to the publishing process, the editing process. So I always like to go to those kinds of events, because then you know how people do publish, how people do editing, and sometimes it can be related to translation, but sometimes it can also be related to just how language works and how literature gets moved around. So yeah, editing and publishing. Those are like the kind of two things that I also like to work with.
Can you explain what editing is? Is it the same as revision?
Editing usually is used more for a text that is just that text. So the editor goes through the text and decides if there are grammatical mistakes that could be changed or syntactic, but also content. Like if a passage doesn't make sense with the following passage, then it also makes change about this, and an editor that knows what they're doing also can help with content and let the author know if it's going to help with the readers or not, if it's going to engage. Revision for me is more in the translation, at least when talking about revision of translation, it's also been having that source text as a tool. So you cannot only do revision seeing the target text, because you have to make sure that the translator that worked with the text first didn't miss any information, any critical information that needs to be in the target text. So that's why you always have to make sure you have the source text to verify, to correspond. But then there's also the second step where you just look at this target text and make sure that it works as a text in itself without anything else around it.
Mm-hmm. So I know that many people think that revision is quite easy. Like I personally think it's even more challenging than translation itself. So like what is revision for you?
It can be challenging because you are working with someone else's work and it's not something that you're creating from scratch and it's all your responsibility. But you really have to be mindful that there's someone behind that translation, someone that worked with that and that really gave his effort to have that translation. I really like revision though because I get to learn from other translators' strategies. For example, if I'm reading the source text and I see a sentence that I'm like, oh, I don't know how I will do that, but then I see the translators and I can see, oh, this is how that person did it, and I can understand why, and I can use that for my next translation. So that's why I enjoy it, because I get to see that other person's world and how their mind works when it comes to words and languages. But yeah, it can also be challenging. And it's more challenging when the translation is bad. Then that's a problem. Because then you have to pretty much recreate the whole text, the whole translation. And also at least on my part, I always feel bad that I'm gonna make the other person feel bad, but at the end, it will also help them learn and develop as translators.
Can you tell us about more in detail about your revision process? So you already mentioned that you starting with analyzing the source text. So.
Yeah, if it's a regular sized source text, I first read that text. If it's too long, I might try to do side by side just because of time constraints. But I read the source text first, so I make sure that I know all the vocabulary. If there's any words that I don't know, I can search for them. If there's any concepts that I don't know, I can do some research. And after that, I start doing side by side comparison, seeing if I can find any opportunities instances where the translator might have missed some information or a word, or maybe there was a misinterpretation on what the meaning really is trying to say. And then, of course, I also look for grammatic mistakes, syntactic mistakes, and sometimes, although that's where revision really becomes tricky, when you have to put aside your personal preferences for how you say some things. So sometimes when I think that something might sound better, I don't just write it with my track changes, but I put a comment on it. And that way the translator gets a chance to see both options and choose. While if you put it just like on track changes, you write it and then you delete the other option, the translator might feel like a little attacked maybe, because they know that's a good option and it's nothing bad with that one. but just you scratching what they say might really change on how they relate to your revisions.
Mhm. What is important to keep in mind before you revise a text, a translation?
I think this aspect of personal preference, I think that's the most important thing. To every time that you are making a change, you are sure it's not because just that's how you like it, but it's because there's something in the language that doesn't agree with it, or there's a rule, grammatical rule that says this shouldn't happen. So yeah, having this personal bias aside, so that way when you revise, you're only doing it in the best interest of the text and in the best interest of the language, and not just on how you want things to be.
Are there any types of documents that are more challenging for revision than others?
Definitely bad translations, because then you have to revise everything. In the case of English and Spanish, legal text, because they are very different types of monsters themselves, so you always have to make sure that the legal vocabulary is being matched to the English, but it's also itself correct vocabulary in the Spanish text. And because there's a lot of going around things in Spanish lingual vocabulary, then it makes it a little harder, and just trying to follow what it's saying, it always makes harder for the revision process.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what self-revision is? And how do you approach?
Self-revision, I will see more as a little bit of a last. Well, no. Before I send to the revision to the actual reviser, I do my self-revision. So I usually try and make sure that the source text has that all the information on the source text is there. But at some point, I also just look at the text itself, at the target text, and so I can read it and make sure it reads okay. I always try to give myself time between when I finish the translation and when I do my self-revision. And then there's always self-revision, just like right at the end, after you get your revision from the reviser and you accept or reject their changes, or maybe change some things yourself. There's always a good idea to put a little more time aside, and then at the end, before you submit to the client, make a final self-revision so you are sure that all information is there, and at the end, just that the text itself can stand alone by what it is, by a Spanish text that you think might have been written on that language, but that doesn't have to have such a strong connection with the source text, but it's just like its text.
Okay, thank you so much, Ixchel, for joining us.